And joining us now in studio, Dean Buonomano, neurobiologist and author of Brain Bugs, How the Brain's Flaws Shape Our Lives. Hello, nice to meet you.
It's my pleasure, Piya. It's nice to be here.
Okay, so the book's called Brain Bugs. Tell me, what are brain bugs?
Well, they're not insects, so I'm using
That's
the term. I'm using the term bugs to refer to the flaws in the same sense that we talk about a computer bug, that something does something imperfectly. Our brain does things imperfectly. So the brain is a computational device. It's a wonderful device. It's the most complex thing. It's the most complex device in the known universe. And it's built of neurons. But somehow, the 100 billion neurons in your brain get together and generate consciousness. They give you awareness. They give you the ability, give us the ability to conduct this interview. They give you the ability to feel pain and pleasure and love and hate. So in order to understand who we are, we need to peer inside the brain. And in doing so, we see that it's an imperfect device. There are flaws and limitations. And ultimately, as members, as individuals and as members of society, I think we'd be a bit better off if we paid a bit more attention to the natural flaws and to the limitations of the brain. Because in the end, much of what's wrong with society can be traced to how our brains work.
Okay, we're going to talk about those flaws and how it plays out, how they play out societally. But you keep saying the word imperfect. So I want you to give me an example of the imperfect design of evolution in the animal kingdom.
So evolution is a very powerful designer, if you will. But it's very imperfect, so it's very sloppy and kludgy. So you look at very strange things that are non-optimal in evolution. We have aquatic mammals that can't breathe underwater. Sometimes the heads of babies don't fit through the birth canal. We all have a blind spot in our retina that we don't notice, but there's like a little hole in your camera that you would give back to the manufacturer if you were a camera with a little hole in it, but we have a blind spot in our retinas. So evolution works in a manner that it's just trying to make little improvements little by little that are a bit better than the previous design, but it can never go back and redesign something from scratch. And this creates a whole variety of brain bugs, and sometimes of bugs in evolution or in the brain. So if we look at another species, for example, moths, that in present day, we've all seen a moth fly spiral-like into a candle or into a flame. That's obviously a pretty serious defect in the design process. Or you look at a skunk, and I talk about this a bit. A skunk will often has this incredible defense mechanism, right? In which if it's attacked by a predator, it will turn around, lift its tail, and spray this very powerful odor, which is very effective. But if it's being threatened by a car, it's not a good behavior to have. And these bugs, if you will, arise because the animals did not evolve to live in the world we currently live. It's been changed by artificial light. It's changed by automobiles. So the human brain, we have a lot of history of a time and place we know we weren't designed to live in.
Does that mean our brains, our neural operating systems are sort of out of date?
Absolutely, absolutely. So we evolved for a time and place that we no longer live in. So in the same way that the skunk is poorly adapted to deal with cars, or the moth is poorly adapted to deal with artificial light, we're poorly adapted to deal with much of what happens in the modern world, whether it's memorization of large numbers of random names or numbers is something that obviously we didn't evolve to do with, because it's a relatively recent cultural invention, and we fear the wrong things in large part. So there's a lot of context in the world that we simply didn't evolve to cope with.
But I guess, you know, we usually use the analogy of the brain to the modern day computer. And with computers anyways, we can upgrade to help the computer get better. Can we upgrade our brains?
Not in any convenient sense. So if we look at the brain's neural operating system, so what I'll sort of refer to that as is the set of instructions written down in your DNA that carries the information on how to build the brain, how your brain gets built, how it works, and how, and the biases we come preloaded with, what we should fear, for example. And it's very, very different from a modern day computer because it's hardwired So we can't update certain parts of it. But we can, what's wonderful about our brains and truly amazing is that we've gotten this far because it's adaptive, right? Because we can learn. Whether you grow up in the Amazon or you grow up in Toronto, the same brain can adapt to that specific location.
Okay, so we're not totally...
We're not hardwired, we're not fixed, but we're strongly constrained by how the brain works. And the brain has fundamental properties, and you can easily see this, right? So you mentioned digital computers that are just superbly capable of doing numerical calculations. No matter how much any human will ever practice numerical calculations, they'll never divide 10-digit numbers with the speed, accuracy, and precision as a computer. It's just not going to happen. So that's a hard constraint. Doesn't matter where you grew up. It doesn't matter how much you practice. It's just the brain did not evolve to do those numerical calculations, and it won't. It's a question of the hardware, how the brain is built.
So the robots win on numerical calculations?
There's no way we're catching up to them on that realm.
Okay, I want to talk about where our brain bugs reside, and essentially that's our memory. And you say that there are two types of memory. What are they?
Yes, so the brain bugs first reside in many different aspects of how the brain works. So one is memory. So it's useful to talk about human memory in terms of two types. We have what we call the declarative memory and the procedural memory. So you can think of what you normally think of your memory as what's the capital of Ontario, what's the capital of France. That's your declarative memory. You can think of that and declare it. Now, if you look at something like how to ride a bike, or how to type, and how to walk or swim, those are things that, or if you can juggle and I ask you, well, Piya, tell me how to juggle, you can describe it all day long, but I'm not going to learn from just hearing you describe how it is that you juggle. But if you know the capitals of all the countries in South America, that I could learn from just hearing you talk. So there's two very different types of memory, and you get a feel for this. If I ask you your telephone number, you can just declare that. You can verbally tell me what it is. But sometimes, I don't know if this happens to you, Piya, but perhaps you have a PIN number on your ATM machine, and that one you probably don't give out very often. And sometimes if I need to give that out, perhaps I'm being mugged or something, then I can't access it very well, but I know it because I can type it in. So that's procedural memory. That's a motor memory because it's harder to declare.
This exact thing happened to me the other day. My husband asked me about my frequent flyer number, whatever, and I couldn't tell him. And I went like this, and I could type it.
Wow.
Isn't that weird?
So,
anyway.
So that's exactly the good way to think of the distinction. You have two types of memory. One might be procedural in terms of typing, for example, or motor pattern, or habit, where the other is declarative.
Okay. Now, let's keep with the computer analogy, because in your book you say that our memory is like the World Wide Web.
Yeah, so that's another useful analogy. So, and it's just an analogy, let's make that clear. But one thing amazing about human memory is how associative it is. So, and what do I mean by that? If I ask you a couple of questions, so for example, if I ask you, in what continent is Kenya?
Africa.
What are the two opposing colors in the game of chess?
Black and white.
And then if I ask you, think of any animal, what pops into your head?
Zebra.
Maybe zebra. Thanks for playing along.
Zebra. I know that because I read about it in your book. But I did do that when I read your book. I actually came up with zebra.
Good to know. And many people will indeed think of zebra. So what I'm saying is that the information is stored through association. So thinking of Africa, thinking of black and white, increases your likelihood of thinking of zebra because we store information in a highly associative fashion. So that's the analogy with the World Wide Web. So in the same sense that if we go to the TVO website, there's going to be links to educational programs, other TV shows, probably not much about soccer in the Middle East because the web is organized in a manner in that related concepts, related topics are linked to each other. And the same thing happens in your brain. So that's why if I say Winter Olympics, here in Canada, people might think of Calgary or Vancouver. In the United States, people won't think of that. They might think of Salt Lake City and Utah. So, and what's important to realize here is this is a basic property of how your brain works. So the neurons, so those are the building blocks each one of those neurons can communicate with tens of thousands of other neurons in your brain. So it's incredibly well set up to make a web. And even the links, the associations, occur at the level of synapses. So synapses are the connections between the neurons, and you have maybe 100 trillion synapses in your brain. And there's actually little proteins at each one of your synapses that make associations or pick coincidence between activity in one neuron and the other. So as a piece of hardware, the brain is incredibly well set up to make associations, to make sense of the world by what's linked to what. And this has a very powerful feature, but also creates some bugs.
Okay. You also lay out this concept of priming, which, you know, makes our brains work the way they do.
Right.
So now tell me what priming is.
So priming was what I just primed you to say zebra when I asked mentioned Africa and mentioned black and white. So that was an example of priming. So if I say I had sushi last night, and then that might prime you to tell me a story about your trip to Japan. So much of how we interact with each other is based on one concept, priming, activating, spreading to another. So we talked a bit about Los Angeles. I said I'm from Los Angeles. You told me you have a sister in Los Angeles. So that's priming. So, and that has very important property to allow us to understand what we're saying. So if I say something like, Johnny fell off the wagon, and you and I are standing in a playground, you know, the context sort of primes you to understand that what I meant by that was that a child fell off a toy wagon. But if you and I are in a bar, and I say Johnny fell off the wagon, that probably means we have a friend that started drinking again. So much of what we do relies on this. But there's a downside here to priming, which is that it affects how our decisions are made unconsciously. So an example here is if I say, okay, you have to make a decision about a surgery. And there's this one surgery that has these properties and has a 90% survival rate.
Pretty good.
And then I tell you, well, there's this other surgery that has a 10% mortality rate. Now, those are the same things, right?
Right.
But the 90% survival rate will sound a lot better to a lot of people because in a way they're primed by the positives. So there's a lot of cases where we make irrational decisions because of the way the sentence is framed. So study upon study show that indeed if you give people options such as those, something with a 90% survival rate or 10% mortality rate, or you're going to lose half your money or keep half your money, we can be biased by the way the question is framed.
Sounds manipulative almost, that priming sort of manipulative.
Absolutely. I mean, it can be used to manipulate, and that happens a lot in advertising, so that's indeed. But it's also a feature, so it wasn't designed to manipulate or to not manipulate. It's simply a property of the human brain. It's built in, and if I say cat, as much as you try, you probably want to think of dog. So am I manipulating? No, it depends on the context, but it's just a property of how your brain works that can be used against you under some circumstances.
You talk about a very common struggle that most humans have, which is remembering your name, or each other's names, or someone that we've seen on the street once. I'll forget your name by next Tuesday. Someone will say, who did you interview? I'm like, this guy that wrote brain bugs, but I can't remember. So tell me the process that our brains go through that make it, why can't we do this? Why can't I remember your name's Dean Buonomano next Tuesday?
Right, and I already forgot your name, Piya. No, so I'm not even going to try to say your last name.
Fair enough.
So, first place, it's nice to point out, right? The act of naming each other is something very unique to humans again, right? I mean, animals don't call each other by names. It's something that emerged very recently in human evolution, in really human cultural evolution, I should say. So it's pretty clear that the brain didn't evolve to store numbers. Store names. It evolved to store patterns, to recognize people, to locomote in the world, to get around, to recognize a tree, to distinguish it from branches from a snake, but not names. And this, one of the consequences of that, we really are quite poor at memorizing names. So saying, oh, Piya, I have a horrible memory for names, a bit like saying, oh, Piya, I'm human. And this has been shown in a number of experiments. So one of the best ways to look at this is what's called the Baker-Baker paradox. So if you meet somebody on a plane and they tell you, I am a baker. And then the next week you meet somebody else and they say, I am Mr. Baker. You're more likely to remember the profession of somebody than the name, which is a bit odd, right? Because here it's the same word. It's both baker or potter or farmer or farmer. So how is that? And the reason it goes back to what we were just talking about, the associative architecture of the brain. When you hear the profession, when you hear the word baker in the context of the profession, all these other concepts get primed. So what does baker, the profession, make you think of?
Donuts.
Donuts or pastries, bread, sugar, getting up early, funny hats. And so that helps you memorize the profession. Now, if somebody says, I am Mr. Baker, there's not much priming going on there, because that concept of the name is sort of like a website that doesn't have many links, whereas the profession baker is sort of like a website that has a lot of links. So the more linked a concept has, the easier it is to remember. And names don't generally have many links unless you know somebody called Baker.
How come, Mr. Baker, how come though some people are better at remembering names than other people?
Yeah. There's a lot of variation. And I think the reasons are very similar to, well, why are some people better runners than other people? And it's a bit to do with genetics, it's a bit due to practice and environment, and how the brain was originally wired up. So we don't, some people are annoyingly good at memorizing names, aren't they? And it's not that they have a different brain, but they still forget people. There's a lot of variation, and that's one of the beautiful aspects of humans, right? Is we are variable and we're all a bit different. And so these variances are very natural.
You know, forgetting someone's name or not remembering someone's name is a bit innocuous in the grand scheme of things, but you say that, you know, the associative nature of our brains have much more dire implications. So when we view different groups of people, how does our associative nature of our brain work? So
associations work as a part of what we're exposed to in our environment. So if we're in the United States or in Canada and I say cow, people might think of hamburger or meat. But if you're in India, perhaps you think of divine, right? Because it symbolizes something else. So no matter what we're exposed to in our environment, the brain picks up and makes associations. So whether you're in an environment in which you get a lot of exposure through the media perhaps, or through culture, that maybe Muslims are terrorists, or that women are not good at math, or that Americans are gun nuts, or something like that, these associations get built into your brain, so they get connected, and one thing can prime the other. Now, does that affect who we are? Does it affect
my behavior? That's
the question, Piya. And there's evidence that it does to a degree, but it's very hard to really say. So in the same sense that I sort of primed you to say zebra, the question is do all these preconceived or sort of pre-established associations in your brain affect how you think of people? And the science isn't strong enough to speak to that definitely yet, so I want to be careful there. But on the other hand, on the same token, the structure of your brain has to influence how you think about things. So it's possible that that could contribute to when we're trying to make unbiased judgments as to who to hire. If you're hiring two people and their CVs look the same and it's for an engineering job and you have a preconceived notion that men are better at math, does that affect your decision? It's hard to say, but it's certainly a possibility we should keep in mind.
You write about so many great experiments and interesting experiments in your book, and one of them that I found so interesting was this rude versus polite word experiment. So tell us what that's about.
So those are experiments done by some psychologists that are now at Princeton. And here the notion is it's, again, very similar to the priming, but it's behavior. So again, remember what I said about the brain and neurons being incredibly interconnected. So neurons are very extroverted because each neuron communicates with tens of thousands of others. So your brain is not compartmentalized like a chip on a computer where you have part of the computer does the graphic part, some of it does the numerical calculations, some of it does the memory. In your brain, everything is mixed up. So in this example that you're referring to, what they did was they gave people some word puzzles. And some, for one group, those puzzles had a lot of words related to being very patient, polite, kind. And for the other group, there was just a lot of words related to being rude, in a hurry, pushy, and so forth. And that was, as far as the subjects were concerned, that was what the study was about. But what they really tested after was they said, okay, the study's over, now go talk to those gentlemen over there and see what the next stage is. And they were pretending to talk on the phone, the researchers they were supposed to talk to. And the real question was, how long they waited to interrupt the ongoing phone conversation or the perceived ongoing conversation. So the result was that indeed the people who did the rude word puzzles interrupted more quickly than the people that did the patient puzzle. So it's the idea that if you're thinking of something, even unconsciously, that affects how we might behave. You know, if you're hungry and you do your weekly shopping, I at least buy more than I really need to or really intended to, because everything is connected. The brain is not compartmentalized. So it's something important to keep in mind that even at the unconscious level, we have a lot going on that we don't always fully have access to.
That's why every diet book will tell you never to go grocery shopping
Right.
on an empty stomach because you will overbuy.
I didn't even know that. So that's written down in the diet books.
Yeah, the diet.
Okay,
Well,
good.
I haven't read
Good
every
to
one
know.
of them, but a lot of them say that, and I'm assuming that that's the connection.
I think that's
that they
exactly
make.
right.
Okay, speaking of diets, you mentioned the word advertising before. We know that advertising is manipulative, and it's conscientiously and subconsciously manipulative. But you have gone on to say in your book that advertising actually changes our actual experience with the product.
Yes.
So take me through that.
So if you are given a blind taste test for wine or for cheese, the package that it's in will influence what you think of it. Or where the results are very solid is, for example, I have 2 glasses of wine here, and I tell you they're the same wine, but you don't know that. And I tell you this is a $58 bottle of wine and this is a $6 bottle of wine, and I ask you to taste those. People's judgment will be that that one's better. Not only that, I can actually put a bit of acid, a little tartaric acid in that one to make it taste worse, and people will still insist that that one tastes better. Because your expectation, your association that you have pricey things are better, because that's what we learn from our culture, right?
We're gullible.
And it's often the case, but we're also gullible. So that influences how we perceive taste. And much of marketing is really based on creating associations. So, and say what you will about a rat, for example, a rat is not going to pay more or work harder for water from Fiji than Toronto tap water, right? So, but we do, because much of marketing comes down to making associations between a product and quality, or a product and value, or that it will make me beautiful. And that influences our behavior. So it's really not that hard through marketing and advertising to influence our behavior. And you know, this marketing and advertising, of course, has a role in our society in disseminating information, but clearly it's often not in our own best interest, and that was clearly the case with cigarette marketing, right? Last century, 100 million people died of cigarette-related deaths, and marketing certainly played a critical role in that. So the marketing, to an extent, exploits some of our brain bugs.
There are, examples that you give in the book that are, again, have more dire consequences. We only have a couple of minutes left, but you write the story about Ronald Cotton. Just briefly tell me that story and what the consequences were.
So that brings us to memory. And one fascinating aspect of human memory, again, to contrast with the computer memory, is that a computer stores memory one way and then retrieves it in another way. So if you have a DVD, you have one laser to burn the information, to burn your show down into that DVD, and that's a very powerful laser, and then another laser to read that information out. So they're distinct processes. But when you store information in our brain, there's no distinct difference between writing information down with storing it and retrieve it. It's much more mixed up. And so this is very clear, the consequence of this, in the case of a woman called Jennifer Thompson, who was raped. And she later on in the police station was asked to identify a photo lineup. And she picked a man called Ronald Cotton. And he later went to trial. And he went to prison for life, and 11 years later, it became evident through DNA evidence that she picked the wrong man. And she was appalled by this. How could her memory let her down? And she had made a conscious effort during her ordeal to remember who this individual was. And so what happened is that during her photo lineup, when she was looking at the pictures, she saw a man that looked like the man who actually raped her, a man called Bobby Poole. And Bobby Poole looked a bit like Ronald Cotton, but wasn't actually in the lineup. So her true assailant wasn't in the lineup. So the idea is that she updated her memory with the wrong person, with a person that looks like her assailant. And human memory is always updating, and it's a very good thing, but sometimes can have very dire consequences. So for example, if you see a child growing up, you don't have a memory of that baby that's distinct at each time point. Every time it gets updated little by little. And so you're merging the previous memory of that child with the subsequent one and the subsequent one. So every time you see that person, you're updating your memory, which is great. But if you update it to the wrong individual, you can have false eyewitness testimony. So it can be very tragic.
Incredible, terribly interesting. Tomorrow we're going to talk about, we all have these bugs, how we can fix them, get rid of them. Thank you for joining me tonight.
My pleasure, Piya.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.